Hi everyone, I hope you're doing all right. Welcome to Divyne Intervention. Now, this is a podcast that I started probably a few months back, and I said that I was going to do it every month, but obviously that just hasn't happened. So we are back now with episode 2. For today's episode, I want to talk about the crochet community and what I don't like about it. To preface this whole video, the crochet community definitely has more good than bad, but I've been crocheting for around 2 years now, and I've definitely kind of picked up some things that I just don't really like. And for today's video, I'm not going to so much focus on kind of like I have a pet peeve against granny square clothing, or I have a pet peeve against I don't know, triple crochets. I just want to talk specifically about the crochet community, but as I say, I do want to stress that there definitely is a lot of good with the crochet community, but I thought it would be an interesting thing to talk about, and I also want to know your guys' opinion, because there might be things on this list that you might just not really agree with, or maybe you have a different opinion, and if you do, please leave them in the comments below. And to kind of go with that, I do want to stress that all of this stuff is just my opinion. You guys are allowed to disagree with my opinion, so take everything that I say with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, it's not like I'm the mayor of the crochet community, so really my opinion is just as valid as everyone else's. But yeah, I thought it would be an interesting thing to talk about. Now, I have a cup of British tea with me. Normally I'm a coffee person, but now it's winter, I feel like British tea does kind of hit the spot. And I have that in a big old mug. And for today, what I'm going to be crocheting is I've started this panel. It's for a jumper that I'm currently writing a pattern for. Now, this is me kind of following the first draft of the pattern, so it won't be ready for testing just yet. I'll probably need a few more weeks to kind of just work on finishing kind of the skeleton pattern for this before it's ready for testing. But definitely keep your eyes out for that, because I think you guys are really going to enjoy this pattern. Where did I put my crochet hook? So grab yourself a drink or a snack and something to crochet, and we'll just talk a little bit about the crochet community and what we hate about it. Moon, I swear to God, you have so much energy today. So I am going to start off pretty general. I have noticed that specifically with more experienced crocheters, there is this kind of black and white thinking as to what is a proper way to crochet and what isn't. A good example that I can use is kind of methods for turning stitches in crochet can vary so wide as to what is used. And I've definitely seen crocheters that definitely believe that there is the best way to do a certain turning stitch and the rest of them are kind of incorrect. And this is a pet peeve for, I suppose, the main reason that people aren't considering that there are so many different things that you could make with one stitch, and people's tension is so different, the materials you use is so different. There's just kind of like a lot of variables that I don't think it's right to say that there's one way to do something. And an example that I always use is a lot of people will say that for a double crochet you either chain 3 or you do kind of like a foundation, not a foundation stitch. What is going on over there? A lot of people will do that thing where you kind of like stack 2 single crochets to kind of get the height of a double crochet while keeping the thickness. Kind of no matter what I do, chaining 2 always looks the best for my stitches. And truly, I think it's because most of the stuff that I make is in the round, so I will always put a slip stitch into the second chain of the chain 2. So I'm actually adding a little bit more to that stitch kind of visually. So if I was to make it thicker and then do a slip stitch into it, it would just look too bulky. And then also just kind of with my tension while I crochet, I definitely think that my chain stitches are comparatively looser to stitches like double crochets or single crochets, so we kind of need less chains to achieve the same length, if that makes sense. And don't get me wrong, I definitely think a lot of people will title something like "you're doing this completely wrong and this is the one way to do it" as kind of like a clickbait kind of thing. But just generally, I think it's very misleading to say that something is better than something else when crochet is such a diverse kind of fiber art. If you do amigurumi, the crochet skill sets that you'll be following and need to know is going to be so different to if you're crocheting garments or accessories like I do. That's one thing where I see, I would say, especially like more skilled crocheters kind of try and categorize things, where I think that's actually very counterintuitive. Counterintuitive, I don't think that's the word I'm looking for. What's the word I'm looking for? Like, where it's not as helpful. It's, let's just say, I think it's, oh no, I think it's a little bit misguided to say something like that. That is the word I was looking for. Yeah, I would say that is one of my pet peeves, but I suppose the bigger pet peeve that I have is, especially with a lot of my freehand stuff, I have received comments from other crocheters that have had some very, I'm just gonna say, nasty opinions. And like, don't get me wrong, I understand that, for example, like my distressed mesh jumper, that is a very specific aesthetic and not everyone's gonna wanna wear it. I understand if you were forced to comment about that jumper and you said something like, yeah, no, it's just not for me. I wouldn't wear that. But I've literally had comments from other crocheters saying that I am not a skilled crocheter because I crochet like that. And again, it's just like this notion that there's one way to crochet, and if you don't make like, I don't even know what to use as an example. Like, let's say some really extravagant, advanced kind of lace work. Like, yeah, that is one skill set, but like, you don't need to have that skill set to be able to class yourself as a good crocheter. I don't know, it just kind of annoyed me because like, there are so many crochet pieces that I don't find that interesting, or techniques that I'm just not that interested in. But just because other people do it doesn't really kind of change my opinion on what kind of crocheter they are. I suppose for me, I just can't understand being an artist and looking at other people's art and critiquing it in a way that isn't, one, asked for, but two, helpful. Like, as I say, this is a pet peeve because I've had these comments, but I also see these comments on other people's pages. It's definitely, I mean, obviously, it's not just a me thing. It's like, you know, a lot of crochet pages, you'll get people that don't crochet on there kind of leaving weird, not nice comments, and I'm totally fine with that, to be honest. But when it comes to other artists leaving those comments, I just think it's kind of out of touch, and yeah, it's just disrespectful because you should know better. And the fact that you don't know better, to me, kind of signalizes that you think that your opinion or your work is better. I don't know, for me, crochet just isn't the Olympics. Like, you can't just like kind of grade everything, and people that try and do that just kind of annoy me. Now, that version of kind of crochets being a little bit high and mighty, I definitely see a lot less, which, I mean, thank God. So yeah, let's boil all of that down to kind of more advanced crocheters looking down on other crocheters that they believe have less knowledge or experience than them. I definitely think that that's represented in, you know, like those TikToks where it's like expert crocheters on live and they're basically just like making fun of the fact that they'll get asked like a bunch of questions that are like fair enough questions to ask a crocheter, but because those are questions that would be asked by someone who's more of a beginner level, they kind of brush it off as kind of like, you shouldn't want to know that because to follow me, you should already know this. You guys, sometimes when I feel like I'm explaining social media, I actually do feel so old, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, the comments I've just talked about are the kind of things that give advanced crocheters that kind of reputation. And yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very small amount of people, but it does still piss me off when I see it. Right, let's do a little bit of a switch up. I want to talk specifically about men in crochet. I have thought about making a separate video just on men in crochet and kind of my opinions on them, because whilst obviously I am a man in crochet, and I don't want to say I love seeing men represented in the crochet community, because if anything, I respect the fact that crochet has been upheld, obviously not kind of by choice, but just by circumstance, by women for thousands of years. That whilst men in crochet, I do think is a good thing, isn't something that needs to be celebrated necessarily to the point that it is, because it does take away from kind of the legacy of the craft, and it just kind of seems like men are celebrated for just doing a feminine thing no matter their skill set or their contribution, I should say. But yeah, anyway, we're kind of going off on a tangent. The thing that annoys me is not necessarily men doing crochet, but men trying to rebrand crochet because they're kind of scared as being viewed as feminine for crocheting. I understand that this is coming from a viewpoint of like a gay white man, so it's kind of, I can't see things from every man's perspective. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but one thing that does really annoy me is men that kind of crochet and they don't want to adopt the fact that societally it is viewed as a more feminine thing. As I mentioned earlier, obviously not through choice, but women have been kind of the majority group that have done fiber arts. So society definitely does hold the belief that fiber arts is something that is more feminine. Now, whether that's valid or not or whatever, that's a conversation for a different day. But I think it's really I'm going to use the word disrespectful. I think it's disrespectful to come into a community where it is majority women. And I'm going to also include that there is quite a big queer community within crochet, which I also think is important to mention here. I don't like people that come into a community like that and try and kind of carve out their own space to stop society from criticizing them from doing that. Now, I feel like I've just written a really confusing like sociological essay that doesn't really make any sense, but like what I mean by this, like I will see all the time like male crocheters on my TikTok, and I'm not going to mention names obviously, but there are creators that I kind of look at and they almost shame crochet from a feminine viewpoint and very much brand their crochet as something that is purely masculine. So whether that's they just want to make beanies or whether that's they just want to make, I don't know, what else do men wear? Sweater vests, but I don't even think sweater vests are masculine like that in society. I don't really know. In case you probably haven't guessed, I don't really surround myself with an awful lot of like straight men like that. So like an example that I can think of is I saw a TikTok of someone saying that like it's really hard for men who crochet because you don't have a lot of options as to what you can crochet. And there was a bunch of comments and one of them that I remember was like, oh, like why don't you make like a bag? And this person was like, bags are for women. Like you as a man who's trying to be masculine, isn't it enough that you can accept your masculinity and accept that within your masculinity there is room for you to do other things? I don't know whether I'm just like overreacting to all of this or whether it's kind of valid for me to be pissed off by this, but you're almost trying to like rebrand something that like straight men have branded as for women as something masculine just because you want to do it, rather than compromise your belief system that you doing something that society considers feminine makes you less masculine. News alert, really, if you want to crochet and you're limiting yourself to crochet or you're not limiting yourself to crochet, that doesn't affect your masculinity or your femininity. And obviously I don't want to go into like the sociological side of this, but obviously I understand that a lot of this does have to do with societal pressure, but to reflect that societal pressure back onto other people through trying to kind of niche yourself into such a small kind of area of masculine crochet. I don't know whether it's just because I'm a male crocheter as well and I feel like I don't like that verbiage within male crocheters, but yeah, it just kind of grinds my gears a little bit. I think it's quite similar to what's happened with skincare, where like men obviously really should be taking care of their skin. It's self-explanatory, but it's in their self-interest to do skincare and look after themselves and, you know, not have like dry skin, I don't know. But because skincare has been viewed as something that only women do, I think men needed skincare to be branded as something that could be masculine, rather than just accepting that something that they have branded as feminine actually could benefit them. So obviously we see just kind of like a somewhat rubbish formulation mixed in with some like male fragrance, and put in like a blue bottle, maybe with some silver, and obviously heavily branded as something that is masculine and for men. Suddenly men feel comfortable using skincare. For me, it seems like a very similar thing. And I don't know. I just don't really get how you can't just take that extra step and just realize that like you can be a straight man and you can crochet because you enjoy crocheting, and that's fine. You don't need to add all of these precursors to what you're doing to make yourself okay with what you're doing. I don't know if that made any sense to you guys. I hope it did. But to counter literally everything that I've just said, I do understand that for different groups of people, being feminine has a much larger impact on kind of how they're viewed. So I don't want to take my experience and say that that's everyone's experience or that I can explain everyone's experience, because I definitely can't. But yeah, men, if you want to crochet, just go ahead and crochet. Anyway, let's move on to the next thing, because I truly feel like I'm doing like a video essay and I don't want that to be what I'm doing. My next crochet pet peeve is something that I feel like has been talked about a lot, but I did want to second this, is the way that crochet is looked at by people who predominantly knit. And I suppose my pet peeve is, as someone who like, I will learn how to knit at some point, but like I will never, I mean, I'm saying this now, who knows? I don't think I will ever like knitting the same way that I like crocheting. So like my love for fiber arts, I feel like obviously at the moment is with crochet, but even when I learn how to knit, it will be with crochet. And I think a lot of knitters don't necessarily understand. Like I know if I knit a sweater with the same yarn that I crochet a sweater, the knitted sweater is gonna drape nicer and it's gonna look more store-bought than the crochet jumper. But like here's where I kind of get a little bit annoyed, is I don't want a knitted jumper. In a case that I'm crocheting something for a reason. Like I understand the properties of crochet. I understand that it's kind of more similar to creating knots rather to knitting, which is more like weaving. I understand that the fabric that I make is thicker, but like with all of the points that I've just said, none of those points really point to the fact that knitting is a better alternative than crochet. Like I think from a lot of knitters' point of view, they can see what is good about knitting, and when they don't see those qualities in a crochet piece, they think that that's an inherent kind of negative. Like the moss stitch jumper that I made last week, I made with Aran yarn and a 6mm hook. Like at no point in constructing that jumper using a moss stitch, which is 100% coverage with an Aran yarn and a 6mm hook, at no point in that did I want kind of a thin knitted jumper. And if I wanted a different outcome, I would have done a different input. And again, I feel like this is kind of almost similar to the first point that I brought up, where I just don't like people assuming that their kind of hierarchy as to what is good and what is bad is going to be the same as everyone else's. Like a good example that I would kind of use to demonstrate what I'm talking about is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of knitters will say like a knitted piece of clothing is always going to be nicer than a crochet piece. But there are things that you can do with crochet that you can't do with knitting. Obviously like a lot of like thinner, lacy or meshy material is better off being crocheted. And if you want to create a thicker material, crochet is better. Even as a crocheter, if I'm using kind of like a knit imitation stitch, like literally what I'm using right now, I'm not necessarily trying to emulate knit. And like it's one thing to make comments to someone about how knitting is better for certain things than other things, but to assume that that's kind of what that person was originally going for, I feel like is the issue. I mean, I used to knit when I was younger, but I don't know how to knit and I don't knit. Obviously I have knit pieces from both my grandma and obviously store-bought. Like I love those knit pieces, but if I wanted to create a knit piece, I would knit. I don't know. It's just been this weird verbiage that I've seen in the crochet community for quite some time, and I've just never really understood it. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think it's just people have a superiority about knitting. Like I do kind of understand that like the way that you learn how to knit and the way that you learn how to crochet are two different things, but it is comparing apples with oranges. At the end of the day, crocheting and knitting are two different things, and if someone's decided to make something in crochet, there's probably a reason that they have decided to make something in crochet. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be the case all the time. You know, someone might crochet something and they might say, I hate how thick it is and it doesn't drape properly. And then if you were to say, oh, if you knitted this, it would have a better drape. I do think that's a fair enough comment. It's more so when the comments are not asked for, but hey. Right, I am back. I ran out of storage space, so sorry if the angle's a bit different. I now have a coffee instead of a tea. I want to talk about one more pet peeve I have before I leave you guys. One thing that I see quite a lot is the way that people talk about yarn and choosing kind of like the right yarn, and kind of how certain yarn is better for certain things. And to some extent, I really do agree with that. I personally don't use wool because I'm a vegan, so that's kind of just a personal choice that I've made. But to kind of show you an example, I'm going to talk about cotton. So I run quite hot a lot of the time, and a lot of the pieces that I make are layering pieces or are designed to be worn as layering pieces. So the majority of the time, I want my clothing to be quite breathable, so cotton is a really good choice for that. And it's also very good for clothing because it has a nice drape to it, so when you create something with it, it just kind of looks really nice. Now with wearables, acrylic is definitely something that is a lot warmer of a fibre, and comparatively to cotton, it has a slightly less good drape. Obviously this really does depend on what type of acrylic you use, but just kind of like for the majority, if you kind of compared these two fibres, you would kind of come to the conclusion that cotton is best. My pet peeve with this is not that it's talked about, because I think it's a very good point and something that you definitely want to consider when making your own pieces. But I think people treat it as kind of like a gospel rather than something that is just one of many factors. So what do I mean by this? If we go back to the tutorial that I did last week, that was for a jumper using, I would say, Aran 2 chunky weight yarn, and that was acrylic. And I picked acrylic because this is a jumper for winter and I do want it to keep me pretty warm, so acrylic was kind of the better choice. But as I mentioned earlier, acrylic doesn't really have a nice drape, and I think if I talk to a lot of people that I was making a jumper using chunky acrylic, a lot of people would imagine something that's super boxy and just something that doesn't fit very nicely. But the jumper that I made, I kind of used other factors to give me what the acrylic yarn couldn't. So as I say, I wanted my jumper to be warm and I did want it to be pretty thick. That's why I did pick a thicker yarn. But to aid with how things looked, I did a raglan design just so the fit would be a little bit nicer. And I also included some decreases around the sleeve just to make things look a little bit more tailored. But on top of that, the fact that I used a moss stitch and I worked my rows horizontally meant that the drape of my fabric was happening vertically. So whilst I was wearing it, it would still have some form of drape and not look super stiff. And obviously that wouldn't have been achieved if I had picked a different stitch and a different way to kind of create the piece. As you can see, I can still reach an endpoint using yarn that isn't specified for that specific endpoint, if that makes sense. And I definitely think a lot of people become quite snobbish around yarn, and I think there's this misconception that to create really nice pieces, you need really nice yarn. And whilst this is true some of the time, and obviously a nice yarn will always help something look a little bit nicer, don't think that you can't use acrylic yarn or any other yarn that is less favoured if you want to. I suppose you just need to consider the other factors that's going to help produce an end product that you're happy with. So as I say, there still is an importance to the yarn that you pick, but it's really not the be all and end all that I feel like a lot of people act like it is. I think I'm gonna end everything here. I do have a few other pet peeves, but I don't want to make this video too long. Let me know what you thought of my opinions in the comments below, And if you've got any pet peeves that you want to share, please go ahead and share them. I always like hearing what you guys have to say in the comments, so I'm looking forward to hearing your opinions. Please let me know if you enjoyed this podcast episode. As I say, I am going to try and do them more often. Also, let me know what you guys think about potentially doing a slightly more personal episode. I did think about potentially doing kind of like the timeline of my love life. I think that might be quite interesting. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed this podcast. Also, go ahead and follow me on my other social medias and check out my patterns which I sell on Ravelry and Etsy. All of that is linked down below. But anyway, you guys, I hope you have a good rest of your day and I will see you in the next video. Bye.